The ACN podcast is made possible thanks to the generosity of our listeners and sponsors, including the Agile Alliance. As a nonprofit membership organization, the Agile Alliance is an excellent resource to help you along your Agile journey. To learn more about the Agile Alliance and our other sponsors, as well as how you can become a sponsor or supporter of our show, please visit acnpodcast.org for more information. And thank you for your support. Good morning and good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Agile Coaching Network. If this is your first time hearing our podcast, our goal here is to hear all perspectives across the Agile community. So if you're new to Agile or you have been doing Agile for years, we want to hear from you. Everyone who comes to our live recording event adds perspectives that help to add contrast to the things that help us to go improve the way that we do our craft of Agile coaching, or if you're a leader within an organization or even a program manager, or even a developer. These types of perspectives help us to build a better organization. And so we want to hear those perspectives. And most of all, let's have fun and amplify our learning across the Agile community. It's one of the best communities out there. Just a quick plug, if you are here for the first time, you can go up to acnpodcast.org. Or if you want to go subscribe to the podcast, it's on every system that's out there. You can go off onto Apple, you can go up over onto Spotify, you can go onto just about almost any service that's out there. And just go ahead and hit the subscribe button so you never miss an episode. Or if you just want to go back and listen over what we've been talking about for the last 93 episodes, please go ahead and click that. Also, those little heart buttons and those little things that help to go improve the overall discoverability of the ACN, hit those buttons too, because that actually helps. Lastly, we are a community of people that are just getting together. So this isn't a for-profit type of thing that we're doing. So if you want to support us and help us to pay for the podcasting system or any of the stuff that we're doing, please go ahead and become a supporting member of New Agility. That helps us to be able to pay the bills and helps us to keep this going. And so we really appreciate it. We're in episode 94. So we've been doing this for a little bit and we want to keep this going. As a matter of fact, I just did a poll on LinkedIn and asked people whether or not we should continue to go. And it was resoundingly somewhere on the odds of about 98% said we should keep going as a podcast because they enjoy the content that's here. As for the other percentage who didn't want us to continue, okay. I won't, it hurt my heart a little bit, but I appreciate the honesty. We finished the last episode, and I think it was Sheila McGrath said, we went through all of this talking about layoffs and all of the stuff there, and it was supposed to be about layoffs and organizational change. And we never really got to the organizational change part. We had a little bit of that interwoven in there because we were talking about people having to deal with the loss of your coworker. What do you do? We talked about it from a personal perspective, but the actual organizational change models and other things we never really got into. And so just to thread in the conversation, there's a lot of popular models that are out there. Anyone from change model to, if you look at Kotter's 8-step approach, there's just lots of models that are out there. McKinsey's models, I can keep throwing these out, the ones that are popular that are used within organizations for doing change. And it's funny, if you never think about what change agents are doing within your organization, they're more than likely following some model that they had learned about how to go take someone from their current state and helping them to come to this new place where we want the organization to be. And there's a tremendous number of ways that you can go approach it. But I will back in and say that there are a lot of pitfalls that happen with these models. And I see change agents sometimes struggle within organizations, or the change doesn't last. And some of the pitfalls that I've seen have been this one-size-fits-all model. And this is true with Agile, by the way. When somebody says we're converting the entire organization to SAFe or Scrum at scale, or we're going to go with Scrum everywhere, the one-size-fits-all model, it is not the best approach for doing your work because one size never fits all. I would never take an organization that was working on ticket-based systems, like they were responding to customer needs that need to be addressed daily, I would never go put them onto Scrum because that model just doesn't fit there. The other one, which is the big one, which is resistance to change. We're humans. Everyone, feels, okay, my way is better, or, hey, all those people over there need to change, but not me. We see this all the time as change agents. Communication gaps, effectively telling people, what are we doing? Which is really something that if we as change agents or leaders within organizations don't communicate what we are trying to go do with the organization, then that has a strong chance of never really getting off the ground. And I can go through others, cultural neglect or over-reliance on the models, as well as just weak leadership, meaning that an absence of leadership. Some of these models, by the way, require that leaders have their hands all over it all the time. And then sometimes that might be appropriate, and other times, how do we enable the group of people to change with a minimal framework? How do we go do that? Regardless of the model itself, and this is a lead into the questions, I always look at it when I walk into a situation is just orient myself, assess the situation that you're under. I happen to use, I'm a big believer in Snowden's sense making and collection of stories in order to understand where is everything sitting right now. And that really addresses the complexity of what we're starting off to go do. The second part for me is it's be flexible. We're gonna hit a lot of roadblocks when we're doing organizational change. It's not like the work has stopped. The work is still sequencing through the organization. We have to maintain some level of productivity, but we might not be as productive for a little bit. And is the organization okay with that? And then the last one, of course, and this is a big Agile thing, which is prioritizing people, recognizing that we need to go address their concerns. Because in certain change models, and I'll go pick on Scrum again, because I remember when Scrum was first being taught, there was literally teachers in that room where they're telling people that they wouldn't have jobs any longer, specifically managers. And I could tell you as a change agent, the worst thing that you could do is tell the person who's currently right now writing the POs and signing the checks of the organization, if you tell them that, hey, we're not going to need you after we go through this transformation, probably going to feed that resistance to change. So the questions are, what is your change model? Why do you use it? What's the one that if you reach into your toolkit, your Phillips screwdriver of change models that you would use, or your flexible, whatever wrench you love to go use, or your cordless screwdriver, what is it? The next one is, as a coach and leader, how do you deal with resistance to change? And I picked on that one in particular because if I look at the common thread of failure within most Agile transformations, is a strong resistance to change. I was just reading on LinkedIn this morning about how developers hate Scrum. And hate's a big word there. I'm not sure that overgeneralization is true, but it might be after a decade or so of Scrum, maybe they do. But the question is now, if you wanted to go change them again, are they going to be resistant to that? And then also you can pick any other pitfall that you're dealing with. Please bring that in and say, hey, I'm dealing with this. And you can even ask people here on this call if you have a perspective to that. Bonus question, share a great story of an organizational change that worked. I think sometimes we focus on the stuff that doesn't work. And I would really love to hear a story of something that really went well for you. And that way, let's amplify those great stories, because those great stories help to go feed more great stories. So with that, to kick us off, Shauna, did you want to start us off?
Sure, I can hop in here. So I want to clarify, I think as we're talking about change, there's a few different things. Number one, as we were threading through the conversation around layoffs, I feel like layoffs tend to break all of these models. There's a lot of impact. There's a lot of hurt that happens in an organization, and that's much different than I would say if you're doing some org changes. I feel like while there is, so my conversation is really going to be more around organizational change, and when org changes are happening more thoughtfully in the organization, and we're not just trying to cut budget and let people go. So I'm just going to state that. I don't know that I necessarily follow any of these models to a T. I think that they are great guides. I think similar to you, Ray, there's a number of things that I think about just like you. The first is assess. I think the second thing, which is really important, is designing what you want the change to look like. Making sure that you're spending the time, just like you did with the assessment, of understanding not just what the change is going to look like, but the upstream and downstream impacts. And in order to do that, you need to bring people into the change. You need to make sure that you've got the right brain power and conversations in the room so that you can really understand where different people are coming from and why they would or wouldn't make those changes. They can't be done in a box. To your other points around the people matter. They really matter. And I think it's also knowing who your change agents are. Because within the organization, you have some key people who really are core voices and the voice of the people, making sure that they're also brought in as part of that, I think is really important. And so then when you make the change, you've got the buy-in and the thought process of the many versus the impact of this impending kind of change or doom and gloom of a few people who feel like they're doing what's best for the organization.
So just on the perspective of the design, is this something that you do yourself, or do you bring in a straw person, or do you bring a group of people together, the people that you've identified as the change agents? Do you bring them in to participate in that process?
For me, this has been my role for a long time, is operations within organizations, or leading operational change has even been something that I've done in the past. And really putting a draft together, modeling something that's been thought through and you can think of, and you can just, it's a starting point so that you can bounce ideas off of one another, I think is really important. If you start with a blank page, then you just end up swirling. I think if you put a model down and you start discussing that, and it's, look, this isn't necessarily the right way, but this is an example of something we can do, then people start thinking about it and giving their thoughts around it. Really understanding who the decision makers are is also important. So while you have a group of people talking about it, I think at some point you can't continue to swirl. You need to say, I appreciate your feedback. This is the model we're going with, and making sure everybody knows who's on point for that decision.
Cool. Thank you for that. Scott, you have your hand up. What do you have on this?
I was just thinking, based on everything you were talking about, that when you try to dictate the teams, it was in conflict with the teams where they're at and looking at their nature of demand and trying to give the teams what they need versus what you want to give them. And the other thing I was thinking about when I was listening to your comments in the beginning, Ray, were a lot of times, a lot of organizations that I've worked in, the teams are changing and management's asking them to change, but the leaders don't change themselves. And one of the things I like to do is use liberating structures to try to bring people to start talking about how they can support. So how can middle management support their teams? How can senior managers support, the middle management and the teams, and start to, open up those lanes of dialogue amongst folks to see if you can find some common ground which you can move forward with. And the last comment I had is when you talked about that LinkedIn survey, Greg, talking about developers don't like Scrum anymore. And I was thinking I could also look at it from the perspective of, were you actually doing Scrum when you decided you didn't like Scrum?
That's a good point. A lot of times when I see people say that they hate Scrum, they've so heavily modified it that it's not exactly Scrum. It doesn't fit there anymore. One question back to you, though, Scott, about bringing leadership along. So when you have a leader who isn't participating, what's your approach? And do you confront that, or what do you do?
One of the things that I offer, whether they'll want to do it or not, is that the leadership circle profile, where they take a survey themselves, and I have people that work for them or people that they work for take it as well. And I start to get a look into, it gives them a kind of a little mind's eye kind of view into their own way and how they act as a leader and how they may be able to grow from reactive to creative as they move from command and control into more of an agile way of thinking. And that you can then help coach them as they start to look at different areas within trying to be agile versus command and control, and where places they can grow and how they can take that growth and then go out into the organization.
Fully agree with that. I think one of the other things that I've done as well is I've had leaders saying, "Hey, could you come help us to do a lean transformation within the organization?" And I'll say, "Yeah, and when do you want to teach that class to your leadership team?"
Yep.
And they're like, "Wait a minute, I want you to teach it." I go, "I want you to teach part of it because I want them to see that you are active in this." And I think that has always helped me in those models. So thank you.
And liberating structures work great within just the leadership team themselves. Yeah, just it's nice to have a non-threatening environment where people can just come in and talk and not worry about the repercussions of what they say.
Absolutely. Thank you for all of that. Diana, how are you? Happy Friday.
Hello. It's funny, as a model maker myself, I have an intense awareness of all models are wrong and some are useful. Thanks to George Box, American statistician. And so I tend to do inquiry first. And so I lean on some of the complexity models that I know about, the human systems dynamics that talks about first learn to see the system, then understand the system, then begin to work within the system, then influence the system. And I think that's really important. And then I often flip over to Snowden's work about if I'm discovering that the system is not clear or complicated, but in fact, complex or chaotic, or just confused, not knowing really where they are, that gives me some indicators about, do I proceed cautiously and where do I start inserting myself? And so that has to do with a lot of talking to a lot of people, as a couple of folks have said, and figuring out what is this animal that we're dealing with? What is this system? And what are its characteristics? And how do people behave in it? I have a pretty firm belief that every organizational culture, and therefore that influences structures and things in the organization, is about the behavior choices people are making day after day, collectively, and how that all works together. So where are people making the same choices? Where are they making different choices? Where are they shifting their behavior? Where are they holding on to it? I'm not a fan of the idea of resistance to change. I like to think of it more as potentially inertia. It's a lot easier to stay how we are. So where can we make a difference with ease? That somebody said the path of least resistance. I think maybe that's in the chat, but I think that is the way to get started for me, because once people begin to get a sense of, oh, it is possible to make some of these small changes, maybe we could make some medium-sized changes, or maybe we could make some big, where are we developing our capacity to do this? And I'm also a huge believer in lots and lots and lots of communication, and particularly about aspiration, both dissatisfaction with what's going on now. Are we dissatisfied enough to want to change this thing? Or is it not quite there yet? Do we really understand what other options are available to us? Sometimes I will, if I have a group that some sort of steering committee group of folks that I'm working with, I might say, here are a lot of different organizational models. And even in Agile, there's a lot of different methodologies, a lot of different ways of thinking about approaching this. What appeals to you and what doesn't appeal to you about these different ones? And can we custom tailor our approach to change here? And so that's how I go with this. A great story. I have a great story about organizational change. that also gave me an interesting awareness. And this is an organization, it was a governmental organization, had a lot of different programmatic and I don't know what do I want to say, and delivery pieces and parts. And they were all people were already working in program groups, but they were pretty much everybody was individual contributors. And so we went in and we said, let's look at how do you want to do your work? What do you think would be better here? What would allow you to accomplish more for yourselves and for your customers? And so we began asking those questions, and we provided some information about what really is a good quality of work life. What are the elements of that? And what is it that, let's get clear about who our customers really are. And we did some clarifying and things like that. And in the end, they chose to organize themselves in cross-functional, self-organizing teams. Not too surprising, but because the nature of their work lent itself to that. And so long story short, we made those changes. They got themselves organized in teams. They did some chartering of their teams. They began understanding how their work was the same and different as some of the other teams that were around there. And I was hearing a lot of, I love my work. This is now the best job I ever had. I can't wait to get to work with my teammates on Monday. We're accomplishing such great things. And that change worked really well. And so I approached future opportunities to help organizations change cautiously in that same approach. However, the big however is 3 years later, they had a change at the executive level of the organization. And that executive came in and said, I don't understand what this is. What is this this way we're working? This is crazy. I've never seen this before, and dismantled the whole thing. And so then people made choices about that. And I felt really bad about it. It's, I set them up and now there's this painful thing that's happened where they've gotten it all disrupted. But then I realized everybody who had been through that now had a completely different view of what work could be like. And all the folks on all those teams, whether they stayed in the organization or left, which a lot of them did, they always were looking, how could they recreate that kind of work that they really loved, that they felt like was the best job ever. And so I think we have these opportunities to help people gain their own agency around this. And I think this has to be central, because we can't guarantee that whatever change we put in place is going to be the right change forever, or that is going to be supported forever. But we need to also give people along the way, as we are working on whatever change they decide they want, to help them develop the skills of resilience and being able to make choices, know that they have options and make choices when things change and shift, as they inevitably will in some direction or another.
Yeah, that's the perspective you bring, especially the talking about change going away, or the change that you facilitated. We used to, and this is at my prior job at Intel, when I had that team of change agents. And one of the mottos that was on the wall is they tried to bury us, but they forgot that we were seeds.
Yeah.
And what we do with teams, and I think this is where at least we can take heart, is that the people who really get the stuff, they're going to eventually grow into a new tree someplace, and it's going to be great. Thank you for sharing that perspective. I really enjoyed that story. Steve Fraser, you actually had your hand up for a second. Did you want to add something to this, or are you?
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. My first of any change model at any of the organizations I worked in is served to do a diagnosis. What is the problem? And I've often found that if I focus too narrowly, that's not going to get much traction. I've used tech forums where I get together a good chunk of the engineering community and some of the marketing and leadership of the company, their experiences and best practices. And that has generally worked well at all these organizations. But as you say, there's a bit of resistance. And I find that persistence is a good strategy. And if the mountain's too high, you go around and find a mountain pass to get around it. And that may take a little longer, but it generally has worked for me at least. Great stories. I shared a experience report from XP 2000. There's a link in the chat if anyone's interested. Thanks.
No problem. Well, actually, so for people who don't know the experience reports we're talking about, if you're an Agile Alliance member, you can actually go up and read these great experience reports that they have up online. So
for your information, I've actually posted it on Archive, which is open access. That's one bone I have to pick. The Agile Alliance is putting things behind a paywall is somewhat counterproductive when it comes to papers or experience report.
Good. It's available there as well. So if you want, go take a look at those. They're very well curated experience reports. They're very nicely done. So
yeah, Rebecca Wirfsbrock deserves credit for that. Ken Power. There's been a lot of work done in years past and continues to this day on experience reports. The full collection is on Agile Alliance's. I think you can see links, but you may not be able to download the PDF. That's why I shared it on Archive as well. Okay, back to you.
Thank you for that. Jorg, what perspective do you have on this?
Yeah, maybe looking a bit at the level of change that is happening. So where am I in the organization to facilitate, endure, enable that kind of change? Because there are several layers from top management down to the individual contributor who will see especially organizational change different. And that leads to different ways to move them forward, support them, and get things done. For models, as a general thing, I like Kotter because it begins with, if you don't have a reason to change, don't change. That is something that people very often start something because it sounds fun, it sounds new. That is not a smart thing. Understand where you want to go, what problem you are solving, what better world you can imagine, how this will work. If you can't tell that story, you should probably rethink your change. If you're just changing out of fear, you're probably going nowhere, but somewhere fast. So that is a very interesting discussion of what's the positive drive behind the change. Even if you have layoffs for the people who have to continue or who have to find something new, there's a positive opportunity in both to grow closer together, experience something new, whatever. These are the things that I try to observe, let's put it like this. There is definitely the question, who are the people who want to change? Coming from technology, I like the crossing the chasm analogy there, even if it's not technology, if we're talking about people. But you normally start out with a small group, either because only a small group is informed or because only a small group believes in the change or in the chance of the change, whatever, and they need to move that topic to the others and get them to be the early majority and then even the late majority. And then you will always have some people will not join you. And you will have a rather late kickback anyway, where people suddenly say that change is either no longer needed, no longer good, and they will just swing back to their old habits. So sustainability of a change is really important in what you're doing, because even if it's a long time, it can easily go away if you just tick the right box again and say no longer interesting. People can fall back to old habits for a very long time. That is just strong. Mm-hmm. And yeah, maybe for a success story, I can a bit echo Diana on that. The biggest success story is if people continue with the key things of a change and take it forward as a principle in their work life, in their actions, in whatever. That is a clear sign that this is something that is spreading. Even if one company stops doing it, then probably 3 others will be infected by people moving on. So that is the thing. My very big first change is probably a success story in the run, that an organization that was completely project focused, like we have a lead for the project, we get it done, we do the next thing, we get it done. They moved to an organization that was team oriented And suddenly the people at the head of the teams needed to wriggle through 3, 4, 5 projects in parallel by being really involved. And then they had no choice. They just needed to empower their people to do things because the cascading effect was simply mandated by the setup. And that was introduced quite broadly in terms of decision making. How do we set it up? How do we share? What's the intention? Actually, one reaction to the overload this created was exploring agile methods in early days. So that was my entry into agile as well. And this setup survived the transition for that team from big companies, so really tech leader, into a small, privately owned company that kept that part of the business completely rolling and intact with a lot of friction in between, but people stuck together. Really, having people that develop together is the best way to drive change because you have a corrective in there. You're not overdoing and you're not blindsiding. And that is very important for the sustainability of a change.
I think one aspect that yours and Diane's story kind of resonates with me is I remember the biggest detractor in one of the changes that I was running, the person who was against everything. I just learned that person learned differently and that they needed to be more from a reading standpoint. And I kept giving them articles and other things to go look at. We had lots of conversations about what they were dealing with about it. And that person today is one of the best change agents that I know. And they went totally from a disbeliever to a believer in this stuff. And that to me just feels very heartwarming.
If I may add to the learning approach, it's true that sometimes it's reading, hearing, or touching for people as well. In cultures, there's 2 approaches that I've seen to explaining why something is good. And that is either you start with theory, so people know you're really knowledgeable, otherwise they don't listen to your practical stuff, or you start practical, because if it's no practical use, why listen to the theory? You really need to know which group you're talking to and how to start, because otherwise they'll be half asleep before you get to the interesting part.
That's a good point. Sheila Eckhart, it's been a while. You've been traveling across Europe. How are you doing?
It has been a while. I am doing well, thank you. I am a consultant. So when it comes to like change model, going to be a little bit different depending on who we're working with. And you have a lot of different situations. You have, you're going in and you're starting the change, you're working through the change, in which case you would use a very set model that we would work in. And sometimes you're working at a company where the change has started and they want to move it forward. There might be things that you see that are not working or changing the way they were looking at. So the model is going to be different depending on circumstances. As a bunch have said, there's not really a one size fits all. You can't like put these different changes into a box. What we tend to do though is there are pillars that you have to look at. So you have to evaluate the different things that are going on within an organization in order to determine ways forward. You need to look at the culture of the organization. You need to look at their readiness for adoption and changing. You need to look at the people and engaging, what that is going to look like. And then alignment with leadership and that everybody is actually aligned, and then communication paths and how you do that. And then what do you do to start small? One of the things that I've seen when you talk about success stories is not to try to do a big bang and try to do change in somewhat of a waterfall fashion where you're defining everything and you're just then moving it forward based on your requirement, but coming up with the change idea and starting with small changes and continuing to iterate on that change has been the most successful that I have seen.
That's one of the things with some of the models that I've seen, like Cotter's model. It looks like a waterfall because it is. And seldom do you see that is people will think that I do those 8 steps and then they didn't know that they needed to add a 9th or 10th or 11th, you know. Tammy, you raised your hand. What do you have on this?
Yeah, so I learned about change in an unusual way. I had knee surgery this last year, and I was asked to go through a process to prepare for the change. And that's a step I think that we miss in organizations. So I went to physical therapy before, and I strengthened the muscles that we'd have to rely on heavily as the change was being adapted to. And so in an environment or in an organization, this would be comparable to emphasizing best practices, helping people reinforce that this is the desired behavior. Also, something that happened in that physical therapy was I was observed moving. And so my adaptations, my bad habits were identified, because just like when we're working with inefficient systems, people find workarounds or ways to get through them easier that may not be actually approved procedure or practices. And this was like a department where we had a system change, a major system upgrade. And what we identified when sitting with the current state or the older system, legacy system, is that associates were copying and pasting screenshots for trackability so that they could prove that they were within compliance. The new system had that history built into it, and so we didn't have to do that. Had we not sat down and identified that bad habit or that workaround, it would have been seen as we wouldn't have known to tell people to stop doing it in the change. And so it would have been perceived as the new system is more work because we have to do our old ways and the new ways. And so I've taken that experience of my knee surgery about preparing, strengthening the muscles that will need to rely on, and then identifying workarounds that we've had to accommodate the old way of working. And how do we make sure that we address that we no longer have to do that? And here's a better way.
I love that. When I see teams like doing like DevOps, or they're just introducing DevOps into their organization, they will notoriously not accept in the very beginning doing that, as you said, that sort of pre-assessment of, we don't have that many automated tests. We don't have that many. We currently have high technical debt in our code and all these other things. And they're wondering why DevOps hurts. It's because they didn't do that stuff. So thank you for that. I think that really gives some great perspective on this. Sheila McGrath. Hello.
Hello. Yeah, I was looking at it from a little different perspective, because there are different things that drive change. Sometimes it's just a decision by management that they want to make a change because they want to shake things up. Sometimes it's because there's a change in the competitive landscape and they need to change to stay competitive. Sometimes you're introducing something in terms of a system change. Like in one organization I was working with, we were going from a help desk to a service desk. Now, in a help desk, somebody takes for support, somebody takes the problem in, but then they assign them out to different teams depending on what the problem is. With the service desk, usually one person is following that change all the way through, or that problem all the way through until it's resolved. So that's a different skill set. So right there, you need different people. So you need to either retrain the people that you have, or you need to figure out what you're going to do with those people, hopefully not lay them off, and bring in people that have the right skill set. Another thing that can drive change is when you have mergers. In one company where I worked, we had several different companies that had merged and been acquired. And they each had been in a similar line of business, but they each had approached the problems of doing that business very differently. In one organization, the marketing people were very sophisticated and technical. In another of the organizations that merged, the marketing people, the salespeople were going out, they didn't even have a computer. They would write things down on a piece of paper, call them in. Somebody would key them into a system, and everything was very centralized. Those are very different models and very different skill sets that you need. And how do you move from the different organizations that all were successful with different models so that they have one common model? And you can't do it in one fell swoop. You have to do it step by step, trying to figure out what are the pieces that'll add the most value the most quickly. So I wouldn't really be looking in any of those situations. I wouldn't be looking at some theoretical model. I'd be looking at what's happening on the ground practically and where can we add value for the business.
I like that. And one question for you on this is when assessing the merge, because I've been a part of organizations that do mergers and acquisitions horribly because there's a culture. We're not just getting processes and tools or skills. We're getting the whole thing. How do you as a change agent, when you're like bringing two organizations together with dynamic cultures, how do you start that? What's your approach?
The first thing you have to do is find out what they're actually doing, because what they say they're doing and what they're actually doing probably aren't the same to begin with. And then you have to figure out where there are synergies, things that they are doing the same way. And those are ones you can probably safely assume need to be part of whatever you do going forward. And then what are they doing that's a bell and whistle that maybe you can get rid of? Maybe it's not necessary. Now, I'm thinking of another organization where I worked where there was a merger where one company had a bigger share of the business, but the other company had much better and more modern systems. So they knew prior to the merger that they wanted to follow the model of the larger company in the way they approached keeping the business viable and marketing the business, but they wanted to apply the more sophisticated systems and administrative aspects of the other company. So you really can't make those kinds of changes in one fell swoop. Again, you have to prioritize it. What do you do? What's going to give you the most benefit and and another thing that will happen is what can I do that will cause the least disruption to things that are working now and that will get people trained and knowledgeable about what we need to do going forward without having a high learning curve.
Okay.
So sometimes that's where I decide what to implement is what can I do with the least disruption and the least training where they'll actually understand what we're doing and where we're trying to go.
Sure. Thank you for that. Hendrik, we haven't had your voice here for a little bit. What's your perspective on this?
So many things have been said already. So I don't know what to add. I can give you a story and a lot of thoughts.
I would love a story, man. Give us a good story to send us off for the weekend.
So it leans a bit on, I agree to a lot of what Diana has been saying, a lot of others have been saying. Once I was called into a leadership team that was actually knowing that something needs to change, but they didn't know what. And I think this is a fantastic starting point because they acknowledge that they are puzzled, but they also were aware of their confusion of things. So I had a workshop with them where we were working out what is actually the problem they want to solve. And in that workshop, we developed a bit of vision or an idea, which direction should we go? And then with that sense of direction, we started adding people from across the organization to discuss, okay, how can we get there? Who do we need? Which expertise do we need? And so on. And those were really people from the ground floor, from the middle floor, from the top floor, anybody who could help us sorting this out. And that discussion went for something like 3 months, and we had a huge anchoring in the organization. So when it was kicked off, it was a self-growing thing afterwards. And the coolest thing is that this thing is sustained because what they learned along the journey is how to learn and how to go about problems. This organization continued doing this even after the top manager changed. So that was a bit of a success story. And I think the key things here are that it starts with the leadership because whether we like it or not, there's very few companies who have no managers or whatever. Usually in my world, it starts with the manager. And maybe a few other things around this. What I learned over the time is that if you start with theoretical concepts. That's what Jörg was saying. Do you start theoretical or practical? I generally have seen that starting too theoretical is worse than starting too practical. You need to keep a balance between the two. But in the meantime, I almost always start practical, trying to understand what is really the problem. What is everybody's perspective? And once I have the practical perspective on the problem, then I can help maybe them with a couple of theories and thinking how to solve these things.
Cool. One thing on that, and I've noticed this with change agents in particular, so are the models we use and everything else. When we dig too much into theory, do you think that's where we lose people?
I think so.
Okay.
Because concrete people have concrete problems. And if you waffle too much about theories, these people would just think, okay, you're not listening to me. You're just intellectualizing. I had this a couple of times at the beginning, and that was a bitter learning because then I thought, okay, they throw me basically out in the end. And I deserved it, even, I think. And so the theory is definitely helpful, but you cannot stop there because they are not ready for it. You need to get them ready for the theory. After they have seen that you have been actively thinking with them about what is really the problem that needs to be solved, and then starting gently to see how could we solve this. And then you can inject an idea. Actually, I came across an interesting concept and so on. And then you can explain your conception idea.
Fully agree with that. I've been kicked out of rooms too, just with that. No, that's too intellectual. I don't see how I can apply it and all of those things. So that's a great lesson learned. Any change agent.
An example, maybe a practical example. Years ago, you remember the workshops we had with Dave Snowden, Ray? I love and hate Dave Snowden. I'm not a native English speaker. It's very hard for me to follow him, but I love him for the intellectual breadth that he has. But the problem is I was so fascinated by kidnapping, but when I tried to talk about kidnapping to managers in my organization, they all looked at me like, okay, what the hell have you been smoking? And in the meantime, I actually often just go in with the Rumsfeld matrix because the language were like known knowns, known unknowns, unknown knowns, and unknown unknowns. That's on the simplicity level they understand. You know, that gets practical. And that's the language I can inject. And then when they are going into that direction, then later on I can come with, but not the other way around. That's a practical thing.
I think sometimes too, I think we ignore the fact that we've been doing it for so long that we jump maybe 3 steps ahead, and we do need to back it up to, and I think the thing that always stuck in my mind is meeting people where they're at and helping to sequence that change through. So thank you for that, Hendrik. That's a great perspective. We are approaching the top of the hour. Where'd the hour go? This actually was a really great conversation. I really appreciate everyone's input onto this. If you want to also take advantage of some learning, I opened up all of my self-paced learning classes for free through the summer. As a part of this season of learning, and now that I see that the clouds are coming back and all of that, I am going to start putting those back, and I'm sorry, Steve, back behind the paywall. Those will start being clicked back over to the paid set. But feel free to go up and join those classes. We've had about 30 to 40 people who've taken them over the summer. I hope you guys enjoyed it. The feedback, I really appreciate it. We've improved the classes a couple of iterations based upon the people who've taken them. And it's really, if you're looking for the guide for Agile principles or the Agile culture, go to newagility.com. New Agility, by the way, is the social enterprise that's behind the producing of the Agile Coaching Network. And that's what we do, is we try to look for opportunities to go improve work, improve the way that we approach work, and all other sorts of things. Go dig through the site, go take a look at us. We really appreciate you giving feedback to us about where we're going with the organization. The next live event is going to be on Friday, October 25th. And guess what? That is going to be one episode from, we only go to November. We don't do a December because it's hard to get people here in December. We'll probably still do a December podcast, but it'll probably be with a small, intimate group of people that we are talking about a particular subject, and we'll still publish something, but we won't be doing a live event in December. So we've got 2 more episodes coming up through the end of the year. It's pretty amazing to think that we're almost getting to that kind of twist to the end of the year, and we're going to be through 2024. I know this because I go to my local store and see that there's Christmas stuff being put up, which is surprising. Anyway, hopefully you guys have a great month. ACN podcast is for educational and informative use only. If you'd like to know more about the ACN community, please come up to acnpodcast.org and support our show.